And this same variation applies when we think about the developmental environments which language is learned as well, which vary tremendously from contexts where infants are engaged in these sort of one-on-one face-to-face interactions with caregivers, maybe inside nuclear family dwellings, apartments, to contexts where infants are cared for by fairly older peers, primarily outdoors, to contexts where multi-generational homes are the norm. The infant is mainly going to be witnessing conversations among other people, among other adults. And, I'm walking all this variation out because to make it really impress upon you the remarkableness of in all of the most exceptional circumstances, children learn language of their communities. Okay, so the question of how this is possible is arguably one of the biggest questions driving the field of language development, driving the field of cognitive science, driving cognitive science. And it's also the case that the vast majority of research has taken place within Western, child-centered contexts like this one and these sorts of interactions, which might make it tricky for us as a research community to ultimately answer it or get some purchase on the question. So I'm going to tell you about, and maybe another consequence of the sort of focus on this particular interaction frame and this particular population is that we've, as a field, not everyone, as a field, we really come to focus on child-directed language, and that's sort of consistent with all of these interventions in the public space, encouraging parents to talk more to their kids. So really putting a lot of the action and agency of a child's acquisition of language on the parent responsibility. And so, maybe you could think of this, I thought of this as promoting this view of the child as relatively passive in the experience of language learning. So, at the same time, when I was in grad school, at the same time as there were some constant PSAs in California for different talk to your children interventions, there were also a lot of people around me who were doing all this work on active learning and showing primarily in the sort of cognitive development causal learning space ways in which kids were really self-directed learners, were really good at seeking out information, at testing their own hypotheses. And that felt like it was absent from my field and was really consistent with my experience with kids who do a lot of what felt to me like real analogies from the causal learning cognitive development space in language. So they do things like testing out, they overheard coronavirus, the word, and they're sort of testing out like what exactly this word means, making some inferences about it. All these instances, like kids swearing, my favorite example, but of language that it seems like probably, and at least like a lot of the 40 bajillion million hits that you get on Google aren't instances of kids learning from the swear words being directed to them, but instead them picking up, scavenging from their environments. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to tell you about a few projects that I think show how maybe taking this active learning perspective on the child as a language learner might help give us purchase on some of these basic questions in the field of language development and help us explain why language development is so robust. And also bring in some data from context outside of this Western child-centered context. Okay, so one prominent dimension of variation across language environments is the degree in which children are the recipients of child-directed language versus are primarily exposed to conversations among others. And there's this extensive literature suggesting that language development is really driven by these child-centered interactions. And even more than just being really reliant on child-centered interactions, that other directed language, so language in children's environment that's not directed and tailored to them, actually has no bearing on learning. So these are from studies, for example, that take measurements of the child's language environment in the first couple years of life. Count up the number of words, the number of unique words, and use those values to predict the child's vocabulary or language production 6 months or a year later. What they reliably show is that measures of child's active language quantity predict later vocabulary, for example, but no measure of overheard other directed language does. Okay, so learning from other directed language seems like sort of maybe, I gave you the expletive case, like sort of a peak instance of this self-directed learning. So you might think that this observation that there's no relation between other directed language and kids' environments and their later vocabularies, at first blush, that sort of flies in the face of this claim that children are maybe these like scrappy, adaptive, active learners, where like learning from the information that's available to them. So the first study that I have is trying to again take this framework and use it to make sense of this finding. So thinking about why we don't see evidence of learning from other directed language, a foundational thing that I've shown in a bunch of different ways, but is also probably intuitive, is that the other directed language around children is more complex than the language that they receive from. So this might matter in contexts where children receive child-directed language. Because we can, again, sort of build on results from other areas. In this case, in the literature on rational attention, that suggests that the complexity of a stimulus matters for child attention. In this case, in a couple different modalities, that infants will look away when a stimulus is too complex for them. So it might be, if we're sort of extrapolating from that if it's the case that other directed language around the child is more complex than the language that they receive directly, maybe then we would expect them to be disattending, to be tuning out the other directed language that's around them until they've gotten enough language development that it's now at a sort of comparable level of complexity and they'll tune into it now. Yeah. Yes, totally. Great, thank you. Okay. So this first study is looking at whether you can get evidence of the sort of analogy between the infant looking away paradigm and child's online attention to spoken language. And to do this, so this is in the with U.S. kids, and in this context, there's this naturalistic test context for us where kids already demonstrate this sort of choosing the input that they want to receive behavior of, for example, like asking you to read the same storybook 40 bajillion times. So the sort of active learning perspective on that would be something like, the kids having you read that 40 million times because there's still something that they're getting out of it. Okay, but this is a nice context because it makes us able to manipulate the complexity of the language that the kid's getting exposed to, and measure their attention and also measure their learning from the storybook. So this is a study with 4 to 6-year-olds. There's an eye tracking task. So to capture attention, we pick the illustration corresponding to the story that kids are hearing against this distractor animation that's continually going. And we introduce children to the story. At the very beginning, we've shown them a textless picture book so they understand this premise. And then they hear the story narrated at one of 2 complexity levels. In the simple condition, this is they hear the story narrated at what we would imagine is sort of just right level. The complex condition is going to be a lot more complex. And the language of the 2 between subjects conditions is matched on all of these dimensions. So it has the same number of syllables, the same duration, the same speech rate, all of that. It just differs in the complexity of the words that we use. So for the simple speech, all of the words are acquired by approximately 3 years based on previous data. And maybe more importantly, this exact text has led to robust learning in a previous sample of same-age kids recruited from the same area. And then the complex speech, by contrast, has a bunch of words sprinkled in that are later ages of acquisition. So once a boy and his dog were good friends, they like to play all day, versus once they're like two companions, they frolic together. Okay. And so that to capture children's attention to the spoken language as it was happening, we sort of make the child's exposure to the story contingent on their visual attention to the story-relevant illustration over the distractor, and sort of making this analogy to infants looking away from a display. So the logic being that as long as the child is listening and processing the speech, that there's a way in which you sort of can't help but look at the picture that matches it, even though it's actually way more boring than the dynamic distractor. And then when you're no longer doing that, the dynamic distractor is way cooler. And that causes the experiment to move on to the next page. Okay, so children hear the narration for each page 1 time through. And then after that obligatory first listen, so that everybody in the study has the same information, has heard all of the story, the page narration loops continuously for up to 75 more seconds. And stops and moves to the next page when the child fixates on the distractor for a threshold duration. Okay. So there are a bunch of data associated with this, but just showing you one way of, one thing that we saw, which is, this is plotting kids' probability of continuing listening past the first obligatory repetition of the page on the y-axis, and age on the x-axis. So this index of their attention to the speech is 1 to 5. And this is what we would expect if complexity relative to kids' age and language development is what is causing them to, in the situation where children ignore other directed language because it's too complex and become increasingly likely to attend to it as their language development increases, we would expect increased attention to the complex speech with greater age. Which is what we see. So this is, as children get older, they listen longer to the complex speech and less long to the simple speech. This doesn't mean that they're totally immediately tuning out of the simple speech. They're just not listening to it for multiple repetitions. They've gotten the information that they needed and they're moving on. Okay, so that this is consistent maybe with the story, that this is like part of what's going on for at least kids who receive child-directed language, in explaining why it looks like they're not learning from other directed language. And it's consistent with other evidence that I have showing that older children learn new words really well between language that's directed to them and language that they are overhearing in the experimental paradigm. Okay, so this is evidence of this point from the active learning framework of rational attention, or selecting the information that the learner wants to receive. And we see that there's some evidence maybe for children selectively attending to more rewarding language. The other reason why we might not see evidence of learning from other directed language in the literature today could be this other thing, originally, at least to my knowledge, introduced by Jerome Bruner, or at least phrased this way, of learning to learn. It's the idea that children might adapt to their, in this case, language environments. And so this next study was designed to test that idea, looking at a context. So the broader idea being that while Western kids might have adapted adapted to adults verbally engaging them and making their attention. Infants raised in context with less child-directed language and a less sort of child-centered interaction frames might develop distinct patterns of attention and skills at listening in on the speech around them in order to learn. So I also do field work in Chiapas, Mexico, and cell-tall infants there are carried on their mom's backs and rarely spoken to directly, in fact, because they're on their mom's backs. But arguably, I would say, have a sort of front row seat to their mom's interactions. And so the question was, whether infants who are rarely receiving directed language will show early word knowledge or early language knowledge, despite that. So previous studies, there have been a couple previous studies with sort of similar goals or similar questions that have usually used these sorts of explicit measures, like parental reports and expressive and perceptive vocabulary tasks, which we might possibly expect to be less sensitive in contexts where like that sort of interaction frame is less familiar. So we wanted to use a more implicit task and relied on this task designed by Ferguson and Swingley. That's an implicit looking while listening measure that measures infants' attention to between targets of pairs of pictures, and has been used to show evidence of word knowledge in children as young as 6 months of age in the U.S. So these are the pairs for the U.S. sample. And adapting this measure for a field context meant pulling the two monitors apart, making a weird felt hut for us to try and control sound and light. This is what it looked like inside the hut. And this is what which individual trials look like. Okay, so part of the brilliance of this paradigm is that it's the mom's voice, right? So you're way more likely to see evidence of any knowledge that if children do have it, given that it's their mom's voice that's doing the prompting. And these were the pairs of nouns that we tested to see if children had knowledge of. These are one animate, one inanimate following the previous study. And Norm is extensively happy to talk about that. So we had 20 infants, a total of 36 started, and because we wanted kids who were not getting a lot of directed language, that meant specifically infants who were not yet walking. So recruited anybody who wanted to participate, and then didn't analyze the data for infants who were already walking on the assumption that they were also receiving more child-directed language. Okay, so these trials, right, there's the ding. The mom hears the prompt in the headphones, another ding. She repeats the prompt. Her eyes are covered the whole time. And then we measure where the infant looks between the two faces. This was like manually coded after the fact. And the fact that these are in pairs is part of how we're able to get information about infants' really, really, really nascent word knowledge from this sort of paradigm. Is that the signal that you get is at the level of the pair. So the measures I'll show you first that has been used to assess word knowledge in this is this difference of fixation proportion, which is taking the proportion of the analysis window that the child is looking to a given picture when that picture was the target. So looking at the baby image when the target was a lol or baby, minus the proportion of looking at that image when it was not the target. So when the prompt was delivered before information. level of the noun pair. And these are the verbal and swingly US values. But the important thing is that positive values, so positive means here, indicate a preference for the target. So some signal of word knowledge. Okay, so this is our noun pairs right on the x-axis, and dash line at 0. The points above the dash line are positive. And what we see is that so the large filled dots are the mean across individuals, and 8 out of 8 of our noun pairs have positive means. So it's looking a lot like the evidence shown for word knowledge in children who are receiving a lot of directed language, may be consistent with this sort of adaptation story. But it's also the case that, it's not that infants don't receive any child-directed language. So it could be that, when their siblings are talking to them, that those are actually like cases where they learned any of these words. So the hope, fantasy, dream would be to find an even more stringent test. Ideally something that could only have been learned from other directed language, that would never be addressed to a child. So cells also have this system of honorific greeting terms that are used every day, exclusively between older children and adults, in this sort of call and response format. I did a lot of interviews with people, and I'm quite confident that babies were not addressed with these, in part because every time I would ask grown-ups, how would you greet a baby? It was like the funniest joke I'd ever made. And so the question is, if you're this infant on your mom's back, do you learn these highly culturally relevant but purely other directed terms? So give you a, I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but this is greeting an older man. And this is being greeted back. Okay, so there's sort of 4 core terms, and we made 2 term pairs as we had for the nouns. This is what those trials look like. So the moms are prompted to read one of the faces. Again, she can't see. We code where the infant looks. So she says puppy, and then, I did clip a trial where the kid was looking in the right direction. But so this is the greeting for an older baby. Okay, before I show you the results, we know this should be super hard. So not only do we not totally think that children learn, certainly not infants learn from other directed language, but also as sort of target distractor pairs, these are absolutely nightmarish. They belong to the same semantic category. The words, the items have similar frequency. They occur in the exact same context of use, the greetings. And the targets, these 2 faces, are perceptually similar. So in some ways, it seems like the sort of thing that you should learn and pay attention to as a young member of the community. And in other ways, as a thing to use to get evidence of someone having paid attention for. But what we see, so this is showing you the time from the onset of a beep, for example, of the target honorific on the x-axis, and looking towards the correct target on the y, is that infants look significantly more, the pink swoop is the eye tracking data for the honorifics, and blues for pronouns. Okay, but infants look significantly more to the target face after hearing the honorific. This is remarkable in part because Western infants don't show reliable discrimination of analogously contrasting targets until they're 24 months old. So it seems like maybe evidence for this idea that learners are adapting to the affordances of their environments to learn the particular language that's important to their communities. Consistent with this really similar paradigm. It's specifically testing US children, so children who do receive a lot of child-directed language, knowledge of words that are reported and verified, as much as could be verified, as more often encountered in other directed language versus more often encountered in child-directed language. So the picture pairs on this side, and half the picture pairs in the study, were pairs of items that occur more frequently spoken to the child than spoken to other people around the child. And on this side are items that are less frequently spoken to the child, more frequently spoken to other people around the child. So, belt, candle, wallet, charger, those things. I think I would have accurately classed those as things that are spoken frequently around a child, but not to them as much. Okay. And what she shows is that at 18 months, U.S. infants are not showing equivalent knowledge to these, of these words that are more often encountered in other directed language, but are, so not showing evidence of other directed language words, or showing evidence of directed language words. And then consistent with this idea that, as your language knowledge increases and development proceeds, that you're able to get more out of other directed language. Infants are above chance at word recognition for these more often encountered in other directed language words at 24 and 30 months. Okay. So again, consistent with this idea that there might be different patterns of attention associated with these different, with experiencing these different language environments. Okay, the last reason why we might not see, last reason why we might not see evidence of a correlation between other directed language in the child environment and later language development is a just pure measurement point. So in these studies that I've just read at that are measuring the amount of child-directed language and the amount of other directed language, where child-directed language is predicting children's language outcomes, such that more child-directed language means bigger vocabulary, less child-directed language smaller. But other directed language has no relation to the outcomes. In these studies, these correlational studies, we are treating other directed language as a sort of monolithic category, when it's actually probably a pretty heterogeneous category, and maybe more heterogeneous than child-directed language, which is going to occur in a maybe slightly more constrained context than the whole space of things that count as other directed, which is going to include language between your caregivers, language between other adults that you don't know, language on the phone involving whatever, where you only hear one participant, and language that's to and from other children. And all this variability is going to make it so that I think that we can't conclude anything quite yet from the absence of correlations, because this is a really noisy thing to be trying to correlate. So I won't show you much data from this, but we're looking at trying to capture or quantify the informational value of different overhearing experiences, focusing on dimensions that have been shown in the literature to be associated with language development, and specifically word learning. And this is, so we're recoding videos. We've done 3 corpora so far for these dimensions of the speech signal, things that contribute to referential transparency, to how easy it is to figure out what's being talked about from the utterance, and these sort of indices of children's online attention. And we're doing this in this sort of goal. One of the goals is to be able to describe or cast language environments across the world sort of what structure there is in children's learning environments. So these are relying in part on a bunch of a corpus of videos collected by a collaborator who does public health research that we're then able to recode for this these language questions. Okay, so to briefly tell you some insights that I feel like I'm getting from this coding that's happening, where we're actually considering the qualitative variability in the entire language environment, as in not just the language that's directed to the kid. So these are distributions of along these different learning relevant dimensions for child-directed and other-directed language. And so what we see first is, like, yes, it's totally the case that child-directed language is often, on towards the right. It's more referentially transparent, it's sort of more accessible. But it's also the case that these orange distributions are not at zero, right? So there are these like learning relevant features are happening in other directed language as well. They're not exclusive to child-directed language. And in fact, one of the analyses that I've done is try to classify, like discriminate between the class of utterances that are child-directed and between the class of utterances that are other-directed. And that analysis really points to exaggerated prosody as something that's doing a lot of work in sort of like identifying an utterance as child-directed versus other-directed. And I think that that's interesting as like sort of thinking about exaggerated prosody, the sort of sing-songy stuff that we do when we talk to kids sometimes, as a tag, rather than something that's helping you directly with either resolving referential ambiguity or even sort of phonological learning. Instead, as like a cue that this is an utterance that's sampled from one of these distributions. This is an utterance that's gonna be more likely to have these sort of heavy-hitting learning features and qualities and be more more custom to you. And the other thing that we're following up on in a bunch of different ways is thinking about other directed language as a sort of stepping stone. As in here too, so this is from a corpus where there's the target child-directed language, the bright green guys, the neon ones, are to somebody who's 2 or 3, and their older sibling is in the 6 to 8 zone. And you can see that the adult language to the older sibling, in a lot of cases, represents a sort of middle ground between the language directed to the child and language directed between adults. So it might be that other child-directed language, which if you, like I have another study that's looking at how much infants and young children look at, just attend to different sources of input, and anything that involves other kids, they're like completely obsessed with. So suggesting that other child-directed language might be an especially useful source. And then the other thing, so I can talk more about any of this in questions, but the other thing that comes out of this that I did not predict is that actually the entire language environment changes with the development of the child. So I was imagining, when I was imagining this sort of complexity interaction, I was really imagining like the other directed language around the kid is just flat, 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 flat. It's always at a certain level. This is an average of a whole bunch of different utterances, but it's like the same. And then the child-directed language that the kid is receiving is getting more and more complex as they're getting more and more mature. And so they're coming together like this. But it turns out that's not at all what it looks like. The child changes the entire environment changes around the child. When someone's a super baby, you swear around them, no problem. Then there's a time where you try not to do that so much. And you also talk about, one of the things that was really interesting is in this first sort of 4-year period, morphological complexity, so how complex the sentence structure of the within the utterances that triggers or darken to each other actually goes down. And it seems like when infants are sort of are a little bit more object-y, People have whole conversations about all kinds of stuff in front of them. And when they become more like person-y, they stop doing that. So we saw this like total inversion of what I would have expected. Okay. So these are a few projects hopefully making the case for how applying this adaptive learning framework can help us understand really broadly the resilience of language. And really the robustness of language development paired with across the diversity of human contexts does suggest that the learning mechanisms that underlie language development must be really flexible, which is could be more of the assumption that we go into theorizing about this today. And other language one of the reasons why you might think that's interesting is that it's a lot more likely to be cross-culturally preserved than child-directed language. So child-directed language we know is highly culturally contingent. But what's much more likely to be there is languages happening between other members of the community around you. So some of the questions that we're asking moving forward are about the impact of other directed language on other aspects of learning, not just word learning. And one project in support of that is looking at how exposure to a word form in other directed language might sort of lay the groundwork for you learning a word much better or faster. So this is a study where a vendor comes in selling things with novel labels. The child never sees any of the things. They're all in a 5-gallon bucket. Or the mom with the child around engages in a gossip session involving in one of the stories of poisoning with a novel plant name. Anyway, okay, and then we go sort of cross-situational word learning paradigm and look at a few different things, a few different ways of breaking out the data. But one of the things is, whether kids who were previously exposed to these words in this overhearing experience show better learning at test than kids who just learned them in a cross-situational paradigm. Also, whether the sorts of mistakes that kids make are different. So whether we can get evidence that children learn something from, something like that this novel word is probably a plant. So it's like mixing up those bottom two types of words more than the top one. In a project that is currently on hold, but I still care about a lot, we've been working with a German immersion school where that sort of has been confused about why their kids, confused and concerned about why their kids aren't learning German, so the dual immersion school. And I think that there's a whole space of questions there that's really interesting about how exposure to another directed language supports L2 learning, and about finding ways to access the knowledge that children are getting from other directed language in their environments, and access it and sort of build on it. Okay, in terms of questions in the adaptation space, thinking about ways in which children's language processing might be different based on the sort of informational cues that are regularly present in their environment. I talked to some of you about this earlier, but I'm sort of obsessively thinking about distinguishing hearing from listening, about different ways of getting at spontaneous auditory attention or visual time modality, and in general, if it's the case that children adapt their learning strategies to their particular environments, how can we better capitalize on how different children have learned to learn? That's what happens. Thank you all.
Hi, I'll try to talk loudly. I'm really glad that you're going to start looking at phonology and syntax, because I think they are probably fundamentally different than just vocabulary. And I was thinking about the honorific addresses that you were talking about. Are they the first element that, so is it like, sir, blah, 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 or does it appear in the middle of the others?
Single word utterance.
It's a single, so it appears, okay, so then that does seem quite different than your average vocabulary, right? So it sounds like, I thought it would just be at the beginning of the utterance, but it's all by itself, so there's no segmentation problem. And the person is always present when that word is used. So in some ways, though the task is, if you're comparing how frequently or how early these children learn honorifics against, say, US or wherever else child-directed speech is more common, it's kind of comparing apples and oranges, because you've given the kid who's overhearing is in the perfect situation. There's no segmentation problem, and there's no mapping problem, or a much easier mapping problem. So how do you equate for those things?
I don't. I know you're completely right. I think this is like a strong proof of concept, and I think and also know from conversations when I was like extensively proposing to do this in all sorts of venues, that the really strong prediction was that even in this best case scenario, that there would be no learning, that I would not be able to find evidence of word recognition. Yeah, even though it has a distinctive prosodic contour too, like it is the like except for this
But
wild.
I'm just surprised anyone thought that, because you've taken away the two hardest parts of learning the mapping from a signal to a meaning. The segmentation problem's gone, right? And the mapping, it's there every time, 100% of the time. I assume you don't use honorifics to address someone when they're not present, right?
Okay, that's 100% true. But the thing I will say that I still think is remarkable is that I think I at least see evidence in early word learning that a good way of characterizing how a lot of this sort of like mapping problem goes is from a very broad category to a more refined one. And I think that this is suggesting a level of lexical specificity that is still surprising to me. So I agree that the recognizing, and I actually, I had a bunch of other types of trials that were going for way lower, sort of clearing way lower thresholds. Just like, do you know that this string is a greeting? Do you, whatever, because I was not expecting that they would actually be able to get the older versus younger and gender distinction. So I completely hear you on the sort of phonological evidence, and I still think that there's a category thing that I still think is something.
Are you only doing this in monolingual children, or are you using also bilingual environments?
Or which part? Okay, so the answer is no.
Okay.
But I don't know which part you're talking about. I definitely like. There are a lot of reasons why I think multilingual households are really great test beds for some of these questions. For one thing, you can have two different complexity levels within the same kid based on different sort of comfort levels of two different languages.
Towards the end, you were talking about how their environment starts changing, that people who come into the room and start decreasing the complexity of their and I was wondering about that from a couple different perspectives.
Yeah.
So like if there's two people who are talking and another adult is in the room, do they change the way in which they're communicating with each other? sort of and is this unconscious versus conscious? So, you know, like, is it, I mean, like baby direct stuff is people need to know that. But there may be something where parents talk differently around even infants when they're talking to each other, that changes without them thinking about it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the directed stuff also they're not thinking about. That's a second now, but we do have more to say.
Well, no, it's just sort of like, is this a general thing of people communicating that they are aware of other listeners in their environment, and somehow or other they're making adjustments based on what other listeners are in their environment?
I think that it probably is, and that's a cool, it's a cool thing to test that I haven't tested. I haven't like thought about the speaker side of the overhearing situation. But yeah, there are a bunch of neat strategies that you see. So one of the things is adults will, like caregivers will use sing-song prosody. So I kept seeing it in the data and seeing in the data that adults were using sing-song prosody, like this like IDS, infant directed speech, to each other. And I would go back to the file and be like, that cannot be the case. There must be some error, whatever. Go back to the file, play it. It was true. So one of the cool strategies that people were doing was using the prosody to like lull the infant and make the infant like know that it's okay, we're still paying attention to you, but also be actually talking about going to the car wash right now and like whatever, you know. And so it's like cool, like sort of bifurcation of the signal, yeah.
So in which case there's dual signals. We're here, this is comfortable environment, and we're also talking about the taxes or something.
Yeah, exactly. So I think also like how much like, you know, you probably adjust different, or of course you adjust differently if it's your kid versus somebody random's kid in terms of like last time we had a conversation where there's a child around, there's like you have a vested interest in them not hearing particular things that you maybe don't have about a random kid.
So then the second part is to what extent are they sort of conscious that they're doing this?
Yeah, I think that's such a good question. I think that a lot of the, of course, it's like entirely speculative. I kind of think a lot of it is not conscious. And I think a lot of it is just, it's sort of like, almost like mechanical or about the choreography of lives. So they can now, like the baby doesn't need to be always touched and observed by someone. So if they need to have a private conversation that's like not, that the kid needs to not hear, they can go away from it. And there's just sort of like facts of the matter about how
Change vocabulary.
they change vocabulary. Yeah.
If the kid's not supposed to be understanding, you could change the ways in which you're talking about this.
Yeah, they could, and they could just say things in a more complicated way, which is like not what we're seeing them do mostly. But also these are, you know, it's an hour and a half of video regularly, so who knows? Yeah.
So this was a really beautiful and impressive range of studies, and I think your number of collaborators is a testament to how much this is a team effort. So I wanted to go back to the quality of child-directed speech, which is conversations about the here and now, and ask you to unpack that. So a few things stick out for me. You know, conversations about the here and now could have second person pronouns. They could have present progressive verb morphology. There could be a lot of different deictic terms, right, demonstratives. There could be a lot going on. I'm wondering if you can maybe unpack that and also say a little bit of, for the other directed or adult directed speech, if it's not conversations about here and now, is it about the past? Is it about the future? Like, what if it's not here and now, what is it?
Yeah. Okay, so the frame that informed this scheme, this is also isn't like everything that we coded, but was really sort of the idea of referential transparency and thinking about really potent learning instances. So that's why the here and now referential gesture, child looking at reference, that sort of focus on more of a focus on the mapping problem. Here and now, so yeah, it was talking about, if you were talking about tomorrow, something that's not here now, but it's because you're reading the book that had it in it, you counted that as here and now. Okay, that's one thing. And when adults were, so in both cases when people were not talking about the here and now, actually I think I have, there are, so okay, so like there's an example of ordering food, anything that's talking about the present or the future or past, that's talking about thoughts. Yeah, here and now was, it included actions, it included like events, but was like, somewhat frequent in both categories. It was somewhat frequent in both categories, that the conversation was not about there.
Part of it, but like, what's a good way of determining that a conversation is about the here and now?
Yeah.
Is it that I'm making reference to objects in the environment? Is it that I'm addressing someone? Is it that I'm talking about an event that's ongoing? Yeah, so like what are the outward cues that I would use to determine that it's about the here and now? Other than perhaps the topic itself.
You mean as a coder, or do you mean as a child?
Yeah.
As a coder? Okay, so so part of the answer, that is part of why I love the referential transparency thing, is it really is that, like, that's the frame that we're using. And so partially you could rely on previous systems for coding about the here and now. And it really is about, concrete co-present situation. Emotion words were included though too. But so second person didn't get you there. Because you could say, well, you were going to do that or whatever. But yeah, really like thinking about utterance, like crudely like utterances that would be on the easier end of sort of breaking into referential system.
So I feel like the issue of whether speech is child-directed versus not, you're framing that as a kind of primary driver of differences in language learning, but these are embedded in a huge sociological space of child-rearing practices, and it's almost a grand sociological nexus of differences in the way children are treated in one culture versus another. So there's too many questions to even ask, but can you tell us a little bit more about what about child-rearing culture is like in the Mexican culture we were talking about? So, like, I'm including non-linguistic things like how long are children cared for by their mothers, and are they ever cared for in groups? When do they start talking to each other? But also, so some of those are non-linguistic, but also things like, are children ever told stories, or are stories that are told in the presence of children? Just could you paint a bigger picture for us?
Yeah, totally. So that is totally, the bigger picture is extremely how I think of any of these sort of comparisons, like this sort of crude boiling down into amount you get child-directed language versus undirected language is like, that's an incidental thing you can measure that is a consequence of an entire ecosystem. Okay, so if it's our basically always in the sling for the first year or so of life, when they start, until they start walking, moms can tell when they're ready to start walking because they make recognizable motor behaviors against their backs. They are mostly, like, pretty exclusively carried by mom and mature, mother-in-law, sister, etc. And then when they are older, start being cared for by a greater diversity of caregivers. Penny Brown has written about that. It's not clear how much in terms of like the ratio, but you don't hear about that. They spend a lot of time with other kids, they're used to, very early on, they're used to run errands. And
Now, we give instructions?
yeah,
Is that what
yeah,
you're saying?
exactly. They're giving instructions. I have this like, I have this amazing data of, I've interviewed tons and tons and tons of kids now in terms of like what they can do. And one of the things is, basically run errands, and they all do that really early. Anyway, so they go get things, they go tell people things, they go buy things with like, yeah. And there's sort of, it ends up being pretty gendered, but it doesn't start out super gendered. There's sort of a gaggle of kids. The stories question is a great question, and I don't know about stories. There are definitely rituals, there are prayers, and
Well, I just want to say, one of the reasons I thought about stories was because of Karen's question about whether those honorifics are ever used not in the presence of one of the people that are being targeted. Because in a story, they could easily be used, at least we normally tell stories about people that aren't present, so I would think but so, that goes to Karen's question.
the words can absolutely be
Yes.
used without the person present, just not with this prosody, not with this greeting prosody.
Can I ask a question going back to books, actually, to the reading books thing?
Yeah.
It's, I couldn't see the slide, but was only the vocabulary changed, like 7 words? Was the syntax kept the same?
Syntax was necessarily changed as well.
Because there is a big difference. I mean, I suspect if you looked at the speech stream, you find huge phonological differences, at least at the syllabic level. So I would suspect that the more complex speech was also more prosodically complex because we have more multisyllabic
Yeah.
words. And we know that starting from 4 days of age, probably younger, babies will attend to prosodically different languages. So how do you know that this is about vocabulary and not about something much more the signal, that one of them is more prosodically complex or more prosodically what they want?
I absolutely don't know, and I don't mean to be making claims about it being one or the other that's driving the difference. I think that like there's an empirical complexity difference.
Actively equivalent.
That was not what we were aiming for here. Like you get like, you know, obviously you have to choose like.
Right, but they weren't the same number of words or syllables.
They were the same number, yeah, of course, they were the same number of syllables, they were the same speech rate, they were matched on a bunch of things, but not sentence structure.
Mm-hmm.
And not syllables per word, you know, that's like part of how you make words harder, yeah. But because it's like, they weren't matched on sentence structure because of that, because trying to maintain the syllable cap across the two meant that you were shoving more syllables into individual words and you couldn't afford the same structures. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. Am I remembering right from the earlier part of the talk that other directed speech generally tends to be more complex than child-directed speech?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Cool. I'm curious whether there might be different sort of baselines or Goldilocks zones for the kinds of information seeking that children will do. So, for example, will the Goldilocks zone be more complex for children who are learning more from other directed speech compared to children who are learning more from child-directed speech?
I think that is the prediction. Like, who knows, that's true, but then definitely that's the prediction, yeah. Yeah, and I should say, like, so in terms of the other directed, all of these analyses of other directed versus child directed, or about half of the analysis of other directed versus child directed, were before then I discovered this crazy thing in the qualitative coding, which is that I feel really humbled by and excited by, but just like that the whole language environment changes around the child. So definitely speech between adults is more complicated than speech to children. That's true. And I think that it's not linear. Like there's a I'm still understanding how that changes across time.
And that presumably might be different in cultures where children aren't necessarily spending the majority of their time around their mothers, but might be spending time around older siblings or older sort of children in the same community. I'm thinking about the differences between the other direct speech that you might get in that kind of culture versus a culture like the one you were sitting where they're mostly hearing other direct speech between adults.
Yeah. Well, so that's one of the things that's cool, I think, about the whole ecosystem thing is that it's also the case that, like, it might also be the case that another thing that patterns together is getting less child-directed language from adults and having access to way more other child-directed language, like between kids, whatever.
I have another question. If you had like community where both occurred in equal amounts, do you think you would run into an issue with complexity where maybe the children rely more on the child-directed speech because they consider the other too complex, or vice versa? Or do you think both would be like equally important?
No, I think that, oh yeah, I should say that we're also doing this in a corpus where we're like looking at all of this in a corpus where we have outcome measures too, so we can actually test the questions. But I think that my sense though, like when you are getting child-directed language and it has some sort of tag, like this prosodic, that is very attention attractive, and that maybe other sources will suffer. There are also things that are just real. It depends on what type of learning you're talking about, but there are things that are just real about, something that's directed to you is just going to actually be more relevant to you. You're going to be participating in grounding and all this stuff. That's not going to be the case for other directed, and that's not stuff that I'm capturing. Stuff that I'm capturing in this coding, but not in the first analyses of complexity differences.
Jenny never like silently so I have a question actually to follow up on Jacob's question about the sort of larger like child rearing practice of the call. And I'm wondering, and related to your like potential purpose findings about parent or adult generated speech maybe being different when children are around versus not, even when it's not child directed. And so I'm wondering whether you have any either intuition or data about whether mothers' utterance generation varies when they like do or do not have a child on their back. And so I'm thinking about even things that like I used to do where I'm like narrating, I'm not even necessarily talking to my kid, but I'm like narrating my own behavior a little bit more, or I might be like singing more or telling a story even though it's not referenced to the child. Like this thing you were just describing about like talking fun about the car wash, like that constantly, that is what we do. And so that actually does not surprise me at all that that's what you're finding. And so do you have a sense of whether the mothers are doing something different for their speech?
Okay, so I love this question, and I like basically tried to ask this in New York, like in the subways with all of there's like a lot of people with babies on their backs now. I really do not think that is, certainly like I don't think the narration thing is happening, but I am really curious about this question and we are like coding data that will speak to it. So specifically recordings from only infants who are on mom's backs where we can tell when they're taken off and on, and so we can look at mom's language in this two contexts. But yeah, I think it's a really cool question.
I have one burning question that also came from Jacob's question that is not related to research at all, but I just have this burning question. So you mentioned that the baby was carried exclusively before they could walk.
Mm-hmm.
So does that mean they didn't get any practice for crawling or walking?
They do get like floor time and stuff.
Okay.
Like with somebody there, but it's also like I think maybe
I'm just wondering, like, can someone also explain all of this just with a really boring framework of saying, like, look, these babies are getting all these inputs in their environments. This is showing us that contrary to what people used to believe, that all this richness of language learning actually could be explained by something much more simple. Like they just need association, they just need the inputs, and then they can still learn words. So I guess I'm really curious to hear your thoughts around what this all really means in terms of the theory of word learning.
Okay, so one of the, like, part of what I am compelled to say, hearing your question, is like the same thing about the category learning, like the, in terms of the, like, for example, on Earth, I know this is roughly a fair point, but like, I am not convinced, so like, yeah, we were talking earlier about this idea that you can't have unsupervised learning with language, that like language is a form of supervision. Like, I'm not convinced that they have had the like categories, right, to map these words onto in the absence of the cue, which I think is already looking like not very job-associated mechanism. But I think that, okay, like, and then from another angle, part of, so I have on here like this perceptual quest to sort of figure out empirical ways of distinguishing hearing from listening. And part of what I'm really interested in is how the stuff that can happen in this really low level way interacts with the higher level stuff. I think a ton of it is, you know, associative and reinforcement. That like doesn't seem problematic to me. What else am I not?
Or I guess I'm also just curious about what you think. So like if you were, well, really this is not really a single question. Like if you were to describe how this findings changes the way we think about what's learning, or like or including how this like if for people that study or people that try to build AI using this kind of language model, is that how is some lesson about how to make them more efficient?
I mean, I think the like sometimes when I talk about this, a point that I make is just like about the way that we sort of task the learning problem, and especially like in the language development space, like often task the learning problem as one of learning words and like learning nouns specifically, and like that might not be the problem that infants are really solving, and so like one answer is just like, you know, the things that are relevant and important for your context are the things, like, and whatever that is going to be where you will expect to see learning first, and that's maybe, so like it being more socially governed than sort of like conceptually governed, maybe. And I also think again, it's like this thing about the low level, high level thing, that there is probably something that you're getting out of, like, there are sorts of learning that have a long run payoff, and that maybe we appreciate that less. And I think that it's like, one of the other things I got out of the self-help study was feeling like, oh wait, actually, how do I know, this is part of the point of D10 study, but like, how do I know that a ton of, like, English infants' word knowledge doesn't also come from other directions?
I think there's one follow-up to that, so I think it's related to that last point you said, which is, so it seems like one of the like first experiment you showed with the complex and simple passages, that was like among the first one. So you're sort of showing like two parts of the story there. One is that overheard language, at least in the US, overheard language is more complex than child-directed language. And in the have you thought about like explicitly testing that as an intersecting?
Yeah. So that's what like the final part of this that story is. No. It's completely. I like really abbreviated it. The final part of that, you're completely right, is that it's not. So you do see learning in lab from highly simplified child-directed language early, and in lab from more complex language late.
And so presumably you're saying more complex language late, meaning it's not complex for that child. I'm thinking even like in young kids, right? If you simplify the language to a vocabulary that they knew, you should even, because this story, you could say something like, as kids are getting older, they have more experience with overheard like language or whatever, that's when they shift, and it's not actually about complexity anymore. So I feel like you need to show complexity versus simple in younger kids.
Yeah. So the thing that we have is people showing learning from other directed language at 18 months. That's, and the other directed language is super simple. I still think that there are. I don't think this is like the entire story, or could only possibly be getting close to an explanatory story if we have a super multidimensional notion of complexity that takes into account like that you think Minecraft is cool and therefore like are gonna like persist through a lot of unknown words like for a Minecraft like utterance and things like that. So this really isn't taken into account as part of the motivation of the video coding project is to try and like be integrating across more of those levels.
Also following up on that, would you predict that kids might actually learn, like, would you predict like a Goldilocks kind of stuff, so if it's too complex, it might not bother to and if it's too simple, it might not be enough.
Okay, so the other side, I really spent a lot of time with the Goldilocks effect, and coolest thing in the world, and the simple end of it, you can see it's like less strong in their data, just like the visual data, and it's really hard to get. So the thing that I think makes language different, maybe, is that you're getting information, even if so like. I'm not sure you can, it's like harder to have something that's totally no learning. But I do think obviously like if you're repeating the same sentence over and over again, like you get tuning out and maybe that's the
I can also imagine that like my 5-year-old is constantly trying her best to learn from adult conversations, like words that totally legit intent for her to learn.
Yeah.
That's super complicated, and she's just like randomly picking them out and trying to figure out what it is. Like exactly
like the coronavirus one.
Yeah.
Okay. Or
so maybe the upper end for language is also very different. Like the complexity tolerance, if that exists for children, I think very high for language compared to like visual.
Totally agree, and especially again like with all of these other supports. So like it's your parents, and you know it might be about Christmas, and you know like that kind of thing. It's like you're gonna really or about something taboo, like all these